Hey everyone, in today's video, I'm going to be going over what I believe is the best all-around build you can use. Now, the reason I think it's possibly the best out there is mainly because I've been able to clear every boss in the game extremely easily. You're able to throw out ridiculous amounts of damage on top of having so much crowd control, you can almost immobilize bosses completely. I think this gives you a good idea of what it's about. So, let's dive into the build and we'll start it off with the spells. With the first one, we're going with the Flame of the Fell God. You can get this after defeating Adam, the Thief of Fire. Now, he can be found in Leona of the Lakes at the Malefactor's Evergaol. It's a pretty easy fight, so it's not too difficult at all to acquire it. What the spell does is you actually cast a fireball over your head that will slowly follow and track your target's movements. Once it gets close enough to them, it'll explode, dealing large amounts of damage in an instant. It also sets the floor on fire as well that'll deal extra damage if anyone walks into it. All of this sounds spectacular, but there are some other pros and cons to this spell. For example, its slow travel speed makes it a bit difficult to land on bosses that have a crazy amount of mobility, but because it's got a slow travel speed, it makes it really nice for planning out a combo, being able to set up an additional attack to do a huge amount of burst damage in just 1 second. Lastly, for the pros is you don't have to be far in the game to unlock the area from where you can get it from. It's an amazing spell, it's got medium range, good damage, and an autopilot. Like, once this spell is casted, you don't have to worry about it that much. The only thing you have to keep in mind is not to push your target out of its range and you'll be perfectly fine. To add to its damage, I also like to use Phlox Canvas. This just increases the damage of all incantations by an extra 8%. It gets its value because we're also going to be using another incantation as well that also hits like an absolute truck. Giant's Flame Take Thee. This one can be bought from either Brother Corn from the Round Table or from Muriel at the Pasture of Vows, only after giving them the Giant's Prayer Book that can be found in a chest near the White Ridge Road resting place. Now, just like the other spell, it does have a lot of pros and only one con that really comes to mind. So for the pros is it does very similar damage to Flame of the Fell God, only falling behind by just a little bit. To make up for this minor inconvenience, it does travel much faster, hitting its mark in an instant after casting it. I also forgot to add this about Flame of the Fell God, but both of these spells have a knockback effect that can lay out even the biggest non-boss enemies in the game. So getting through any area will be extremely easy, facing little to no issues at all. Now lastly for the pros is it can be charged up to do 10% more damage and have a 10% increased blast radius. After all of this, the major con for this spell is mainly just trying to obtain it, because the area you get it from is pretty deep into the game, so you're gonna have to push through quite a bit before you can actually get it. Again, once you've obtained it, it's an absolute blast and fully worth it. Just go and get it, believe me. Furthermore, we're going to need a Sacred Seal to cast these spells, and for that, the best option for us is the Giant Seal. This buffs all Fire Giant incantations, like the ones we're using, by an extra 20%. What's really nice about this is if we have one of them, that's a 20% damage increase. But if we have two of them equipped, it reaches around 44% increased damage. I don't really need to say it, but that's a lot of damage. For how to come by the Giant Seal, it's very similar to the spell Giant's Flame Take Thee. You have to reach the mountaintops of the Giants area to where you'll have to jump down into the Giant's Conquering Hero Grave. Afterwards, you just have to defeat a fire prelate that's not too difficult to handle, and you'll find the Giant Seal on one of the bodies in the room. So that's a 40% damage buff that is always activated as long as you have a second one in your offhand. Now we can also add another 12% increased damage to all of our fire attacks, and that's with the Fire Scorpion charm. The one drawback to it is it does make us take 10% increased physical damage, but that can be countered by either wearing some heavier armor or a spell to buff us that I'll get into later on. Moving forward, we can go over the close range weapons cause those are the only two damaging spells we mainly use while at a distance. So in our main hand, we're going to be using the Zweihander, that's an Ultra Greatsword weapon. The reason we're going with this is because Ultra Greatswords are probably the best, if not one of the best, weapons in the game. To be more exact on why the Zweihander out of all of them is because it's got the lowest stat requirements of only 19 strength and 11 dex to wield it. On top of that, it's also the lightest Ultra Greatsword, so we can save some points from endurance cause this build is a bit tight when it comes to the stat points. The other reason on why it's so good is cause you can stagger most of the stronger enemies in the game with just a light attack. So this allows us to chain stagger enemies, letting us do a full combo with either our light attacks or our heavy attacks. Speaking of the heavy attack, it's extremely good as well. Your character extends the sword out in a thrusting motion, giving it some insane range, which is also complemented by the size of the sword itself. It's a phenomenal weapon in general, but there is a flaw to it. When we use the flame art variation on it, it scales with faith, giving us some more fire damage. Nothing sounds wrong so far, but when I use it against most enemies, the damage seems to drop off by quite a bit, especially for an ultra greatsword. To get around this, it was really simple. What one sword can't do, two swords can. That's right, we're using a second Zweihander in our offhand to almost double our damage output. For how to get the Zweihander, it's extremely easy as well. You can buy it from the Isolated Merchant for 3,500 runes, who is located west of the Weeping Penesuela. Probably the easiest item you can get, cause you don't even have to fight anyone to actually get it. Another thing we can use that really helps out by a metric ton is the spell Flame Grant Me Strength. When we use this, it increases our physical damage by 20% and our fire damage by another 20% for 30 seconds. So in total, we basically get a 40% damage buff because our swords both deal physical damage and fire damage. Although the only times I would really use this spell is either right before a big boss fight or if I know there's a tough enemy right around the corner. Cause the spell is extremely powerful with this setup, but it doesn't last for a very long time, making it really annoying to constantly reapply it. But the 30 seconds you get, you can pump out a crazy amount of damage in such a short time period. Lastly, to acquire this spell, it's not difficult at all. You just have to reach Fort Gale, go around the back, and you should find it laying on a body between two flamethrower towers. Another item you can get earlier on in the game, and I don't think you actually have to kill anyone to get it either. Now going back to our swords, the Ash of War we use on it is very, very important. If you remember what I said at the beginning of this video about this build having a ton of crowd control, a lot of it comes from this Ash of War, completely bringing bosses to their knees in just a few hits, it being the Flame of the Redmanes. What this does is throw a line of fire in front of you that's got okay range and decent damage, but nothing too special. The way this thing brings bosses down is with how much poise damage it does. If you don't know what poise damage is, it's the amount of damage a boss can take before they get guard broken. Most bosses have anywhere between 120 to 160 total poise, and this Ash of War deals 40 poise damage per use. So all you have to do is hit them 3 to 4 times with this Ash of War and they'll drop right to their knees. Now it's got a pretty fast casting speed and a wide area of effect, so it's not going to be too hard at all to just spam this on a boss. Afterwards, depending on how long the boss stays down for, because different bosses have different downtimes. Some get up faster and some get up slower. So you have two options. If they get up slow, you can do a full combo with both of your damage spells and possibly some more depending on how quick you are, but if they get up fast, you'll usually just have enough time for a critical hit, which is still pretty nice. What's even better is we still have another way of increasing our damage all around, and that's with the Flask of Wondrous Physic. This probably doesn't come as a surprise that we're going to be using the Fire Shrouding tier that increases all of our fire damage by 20% for 3 minutes. Definitely the best tier out of the bunch for us, but for our second tier, you have a few different options. Personally, I like to go with the Cerulean Hidden tier that gives us infinite mana for 15 seconds. Now the reason I like this is because when we're about to buff ourselves up right before a boss fight, we usually consume a pretty good chunk of mana doing so. So instead of wasting one of your mana flasks and some duration time on your buffs, you can just walk in with full mana and start chucking fireballs like a madman. Then the other two options we have are the Opaline Heart tier. That's going to increase all of our damage negation by 15% for 3 minutes. This one's not too bad because we do have 2 items that make us take increased damage, and this would just help out by reducing their negative effects. Lastly, another good option would be the Green Burst tier. This is going to increase our stamina recovery speed by 33% for 3 minutes as well. This is more just to keep our stamina constantly full to cast spells as rapidly as possible, or to dodge any last minute attacks. All solid options, but the only one you absolutely need is the Fire Shrouding tier. Now you can get this after defeating one of the Erdtree avatar bosses in Khalid. Another pretty easy fight that shouldn't be too difficult at all. Now before I go over the minimum stats required, let's take a better look at the armor. So with the headpiece, I decided to go with the Haligtree Knight Helm. It's honestly not crazy important to this build, but I'm going with it because it does give us 2 extra points in Faith. Just using any helmet that increases our stats is the best option, even though it may not look the nicest. So you can do with what you would like with that there. With the chest piece, this one's actually more important, the Raptor's Black Feathers. What this does is increase our jumping attacks damage by an extra 10%. You've probably seen this with a ton of other builds, but it's just so effective. Especially when we're dual wielding colossal swords, our jumping weapon art attack is going to do ridiculous amounts of damage, making it our hardest hitting physical attack. Then lastly for the gloves and legs, I'm just using the Knight's armor. There isn't anything that really stands out for us a lot to use, other than grabbing whatever gives us the most protection, because the Raptor's Black Feathers is fairly light armor and we'll want something to help make up for that. On top of that, we're also going to be using the Greatjar's Arsenal to make it easier to wear heavier armor without dropping so many points into endurance. Speaking of endurance, let's go over the minimum stats required for this setup. So to use everything in this build effectively, you'll need at least 19 strength, 11 dex, and 41 faith. After reaching 80 faith, I'd recommend putting more points into either endurance so you can wear some heavier armor, and mind so you can cast more spells before having to use the flask. I also like to use Radagon's Source Seal that increases our vigor, endurance, strength, and dexterity by 5 levels. Literally every stat we use for this build, so it gets its value. The negative to it, cause it's too good to be true, is we do take 15% increased damage, and it's okay, cause we can just use the spell Golden Vow, which is another fantastic buff, increasing our damage by 15% and our damage negation by 10% for 80 seconds. Honestly, one of the best buffs in the entire game. For where to find this, you'll want to reach Mount Gelmir, and you should find it laying on a body in the Corpse Stench Shack area. A little bit far away, but not the most difficult item to achieve with this setup. So I think that covers about everything for this build. Now before I end the video off, I do want to give a big thanks to the members of my channel for supporting me on my videos and the future ones to come. Thanks for watching everyone, and I hope I see you all in the next one.